Poor black nurse saved a stranger's life in a storm. But what happened the next morning tore her world apart. Dessy Edmond walked into the hospital exhausted and 5 minutes late, only to be fired in front of colleagues who turned their eyes away. She had no idea the man she rescued was watching from across the street. And when he walked through those hospital doors, every cruel accusation her supervisor made would come crashing back with the force of truth. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now let's begin. The storm was merciless that night, hammering the windshield like it wanted to shove her off the highway. Dessy Edmond gripped the wheel of her old white pickup, wipers scraping desperately just to keep a sliver of the road visible. The county hospital had kept her 2 hours past shift in, and exhaustion had settled into her bones like a weight she couldn't shake. Her navy blue scrubs clung damp to her skin, her shoulders ached from lifting patients twice her size, and all she wanted was silence and sleep. Then she saw it, a black sedan parked crooked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through sheets of rain. The hood was raised, steam curling into the darkness like desperate signals. As her headlights swept across the scene, they caught an elderly white man standing beside the car, suit jacket soaked through, one hand pressed against his forehead, the other clutching a leather briefcase like it was the only solid thing left in the world. No umbrella, no help. Just rain and exhaustion carved into his face. She hesitated. It was late, the kind of night that taught people to lock their doors and keep driving. But she saw the way his body swayed slightly, how his fingers trembled as he stared at a phone with no signal. Something in her chest tightened. Dessy slowed, pulled over, and rolled down the window halfway. Cold air and the smell of wet asphalt rushed in. "Sir, are you okay out there?" she called. The man turned, startled, blinking through the rain. "Car died," he said, voice hoarse. "No tow trucks. I think I've been walking in circles." Dessy leaned toward the passenger door and unlocked it. "You'll catch pneumonia out here. Get in before you drown." He stared at her, a stranger offering help on an empty highway. Then pride eat to desperation. He nodded, opened the door, and slid inside her phone, water pooling on the worn seat. The heater barely worked, but she cranked it anyway. The hum filled the silence as she pulled back onto the road, headlights cutting through rain that showed no sign of stopping. His voice was quiet but steady. "You didn't have to stop." Dessy shrugged, eyes on the road. Couldn't leave someone's grandfather melting in a storm. That earned the faintest smile. He introduced himself as Jeff, said he'd been driving back from a meeting outside the city when the storm caught him. The car gave up halfway. Dessy listened but didn't press. Working emergency rooms had taught her that people carried stories they weren't ready to tell. She took him to her small apartment just off the service road, a narrow building shadowed by flickering streetlights. Inside her cramped one-room flat, she handed him a towel and brewed instant soup on a hot plate that sputtered and clicked. She gave him her only blanket, waving off his protests. "I'm a nurse," she said simply. "This is what I do." When he finally drifted off on her couch, she sat by the window, watching the rain soften to drizzle. Her reflection looked tired but peaceful. She had done the right thing. Before dawn, she left for another shift. The couch was empty, the blanket folded neatly. A note rested on the table. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She smiled faintly, tucked the note into her pocket, and stepped back into the gray morning. The streets were slick, the air sharp with cold. She didn't know yet that the man she'd helped would walk back into her life, and that when he did, everything would change. The morning dragged in cold and gray. Dessy's shoes squeaked on the hospital floor as she rushed through the entrance, 10 minutes behind schedule. Her hair was still damp, her breath quick from sprinting up the hill. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit her like a wall. Behind the nurse's station, her supervisor was already waiting, arms crossed, expression sharp enough to cut. "Edmond, my office, now." Dessy's stomach dropped. She didn't see the black sedan parked across the street. Didn't see the man inside watching her through tinted glass, a note folded on the seat beside him. Jeff's jaw tightened as he watched her disappear through those glass doors. "So this is where she works," he murmured. What happened next would change both their lives forever. The morning dragged in cold and gray. Dessy's shoes squeaked on the hospital floor as she rushed through the entrance, 10 minutes behind schedule. Her hair was still damp, her breath quick from sprinting up the hill. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit her like a wall. Behind the nurse's station, her supervisor was already waiting, arms crossed, expression sharp enough to cut. "Edmond, my office, now." Dessy's stomach dropped. The corridor felt longer than usual. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A few nurses glanced up from their charts, then quickly looked away. Dessy recognized that look, the one people wore when they knew something bad was coming and were grateful it wasn't happening to them. Inside the small office, Margaret Torres sat behind a desk cluttered with incident reports and half-empty coffee cups. She didn't offer Dessy a seat. "10 minutes late," Torres said flatly. "Second time this month." "I'm sorry, Ms. Torres," Dessy began, keeping her voice steady. "The side roads flooded from last night's storm. I had to take the long route through. I don't need a weather report, Edmond. I need staff who show up on time." Dessy swallowed. "It won't happen again. I left early, but the detour—" "You left early to do what exactly?" Torres leaned forward. "Because I have 3 complaint forms here from last week. Patients saying you were distracted. One says you left their call button unanswered for 15 minutes. Dessy's chest tightened. "That's not true. I've never—" "Are you calling them liars?" "No, ma'am. I'm saying there must be a mistake. I always respond to call buttons. Always." Torres tapped the papers with one finger. "Well, someone's not doing their job. And when you can't even show up on time, it makes me wonder what else you're not doing." The words hung in the air like smoke. Dessy's hands trembled at her sides. 4 years. 4 years of double shifts, of skipping lunch to cover for understaffed rotations, of holding patients' hands when their families couldn't be bothered to visit. 4 years of being told she was one of the best nurses on the floor. Now this. "Miss Torres, please, let me see those complaints. I can explain." "There's nothing to explain." Torres stood, her voice rising just enough to carry through the thin walls. "We can't afford dead weight here, Edmond. This hospital runs on accountability. You're terminated. Effective immediately." The words landed like a punch. Dessy blinked, her vision blurring at the edges. "You're firing me? Clean out your locker. Security will escort you out." "But my benefits, my certification renewal is next month. I should have thought about that before you decided punctuality was optional." Dessy's jaw tightened. She wanted to scream, to slam the desk, to demand fairness. But she'd learned long ago that women like her didn't get to raise their voice without consequences. So she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said quietly, "I understand." Torres looked almost disappointed. Dessy turned and walked out, each step measured, deliberate. The hallway had filled with staff pretending to work. A few younger nurses looked at her with sympathy. One older doctor shook his head. The rest kept their eyes down. At her locker, Dessy pulled out her spare sneakers, a sweater, the half-eaten granola bar she'd been saving. Her hands moved on autopilot. She couldn't feel anything yet. The shock was too thick. Security didn't follow her. They never did when you went quietly. She walked through the lobby, past patients in wheelchairs, past families clutching insurance forms, past the pharmacy where she used to grab coffee on good days. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world was still wet. Puddles reflected the gray sky. The air smelled like concrete and failure. Dessy stood on the top step, staring at nothing. "I'd do it again," she thought. "Even knowing this would happen, I'd still stop." But that certainty didn't pay rent. It didn't cover the electric bill or the student loans still hanging over her head like a sentencing. It didn't replace the certification she needed, the one she'd been working toward for 3 years. She descended the steps slowly, her reflection rippling in the water pooled on the sidewalk. A tear slipped down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it away quickly. Across the street, a black sedan sat parked beneath a line of bare trees. The windows were tinted, the engine idling softly. Inside, Jeff sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He'd watched her walk in late, breathless, apologetic. Watched her disappear inside. And now he watched her leave, shoulders squared, head high, but something broken in the way she moved. The note she'd left him still sat on the passenger seat. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Jeff's jaw clenched, his fingers tightened until his knuckles went white. "So, this is how they treat the woman who saved my life," he murmured. He reached for his phone, scrolled through contacts, and pressed a name he hadn't called in months. It rang twice. "Jeffrey Scott's office," a crisp voice answered. "It's me," Jeff said quietly. "I need a full background report on County General Hospital. Ownership structure, board members, financials, everything." A pause. "How soon?" Jeff watched Dessy walk toward the bus stop, her figure growing smaller against the gray morning. "By tonight, he said, "and find out who runs the nursing staff. I want names." He ended the call and sat in silence, the rain beginning again, light and steady against the windshield. Dessy stood at the bus stop, arms wrapped around herself, waiting for a ride that would take her back to an apartment she could no longer afford. She didn't see the sedan pull away slowly, headlights cutting through the mist. She didn't know that the man from the rain had just declared war on the people who thought kindness was a weakness worth punishing. But she would. Jeffrey Scott had built empires on reading people. In boardrooms across 3 continents, he'd learned to spot desperation disguised as confidence, greed masqueraded as ambition, and cruelty hidden beneath professional smiles. 50 years in healthcare investment had taught him that the quality of an institution wasn't measured by its marble lobbies or state-of-the-art equipment. It was measured by how it treated people when no one important was watching. And last night, soaked to the bone on a rain-battered highway, he'd been nobody important. Now, sitting in his downtown office as morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. Jeff reviewed the file his assistant had compiled overnight. 23 pages. County General Hospital's financials, board composition, management structure, and, most importantly, personnel records. He flipped to the section marked Edmond, Dessy, nursing staff, 4 years of employment, consistently high performance reviews, commendations from patients, 2 awards for compassionate care, not a single disciplinary action until 3 weeks ago, when suddenly there were 3 complaints filed within 5 days. Jeff's eyes narrowed. He'd seen this pattern before, someone building a paper trail. Manufacturing, cause for termination. The complaints were vague, distracted, unresponsive, poor attitude, the kind of language that meant everything and nothing, the kind used when the real reason couldn't be written down. He cross-referenced the dates, all 3 complaints filed by the same supervisor. Margaret Torres, hired 8 months ago, no nursing background, brought in during a cost-cutting initiative. Jeff closed the folder and leaned back in his leather chair. Cost-cutting. That explained everything. Dessy Edmond wasn't fired for being late. She was fired because someone needed to trim the budget, and a nurse who actually cared about patients was expensive. She stayed late. She didn't cut corners. She made the hospital spend money on doing things right. People like Margaret Torres hated people like Dessy Edmond. Jeff's phone buzzed. His assistant's name appeared on the screen. "The hospital administrator returned your call," she said. "He's very eager to meet with you." "I'm sure he is." Jeff glanced at his calendar. "Clear my afternoon. I'm making a site visit." A pause. "Should I notify them you're coming?" "No," Jeff stood reaching for his coat. "Let's keep it a surprise." He walked to the window, looking down at the city stretched below. Somewhere in those streets, Dessy Edmond was probably sitting in her apartment, wondering how she'd pay next month's rent, wondering if helping a stranger had been the worst decision of her life. The memory surfaced unbidden. Her small apartment, the radiator clicking, the way she'd handed him soup without asking if he wanted it, just knowing he needed it. The worn medical bag by her door, the kind nurses bought themselves because hospitals didn't provide them. Her quiet refusal to accept his thanks, like kindness was simply protocol. "I'm a nurse," she'd said. "This is what I do." Not, "This is my job. This is what I do." As if compassion wasn't a profession, but an identity. Jeff had met 1,000 healthcare professionals. Surgeons who treated patients like billable procedures, administrators who saw illness as revenue streams, board members who measured success in profit margins, while people died in understaffed wards. But that night, soaking wet and exhausted, Dessy Edmond had seen a person who needed help. Nothing more, nothing less. She'd reminded him why he'd gotten into this business 40 years ago. Before the money, before the power, before he'd learned to see hospitals as investments instead of sanctuaries. She'd reminded him what healthcare was supposed to be, and they'd fired her for it. Jeff's jaw tightened. This wasn't about repaying a debt. Debt implied transaction, and what Dessy had given him couldn't be bought nor traded. This was about something older and simpler. Principle. Some things were worth protecting. Some people deserved defending, and some institutions needed to be reminded that cruelty always had consequences. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Richard," he said when the hospital administrator answered, voice breathless with eagerness. "Jeffrey Scott, I'll be visiting County General this afternoon. 2 o'clock. Make sure your senior staff is available." "Of course, Mr. Scott. We're honored. Is there anything specific you'd like to—" "Just a routine inspection," Jeff interrupted. "I like to see how my investments are performing." He ended the call before the man could ask questions. By noon, County General Hospital was in controlled chaos. Administrators scrambled through hallways with clipboards. Maintenance crews mopped floors that were already clean. Someone ordered fresh flowers for the lobby. Margaret Torres received a terse phone call instructing her to be in the conference room at 2 o'clock sharp, no exceptions. "Who's coming?" she asked. "Jeffrey Scott." The name landed like a bomb. Torres went pale. "The Jeffrey Scott? The investor?" "Yes, and keep your mouth shut about that termination this morning. Last thing we need is him asking questions about staffing decisions." Torres hung up, hands shaking slightly. Across town, Dessy sat at her kitchen table, staring at a spreadsheet on her laptop. Rent due in 2 weeks, student loan payment next month, groceries, utilities, phone bill. The numbers didn't add up. They never did, but now they didn't even come close. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes. "I'd do it again," she thought, but the conviction felt thinner now, worn down by reality. Her phone buzzed, a text from her younger sister. "Heard what happened. You need money?" Dessy's throat tightened. Her sister worked 2 jobs already, barely scraping by herself. She typed back, "I'm okay, don't worry." The lie sat heavy in her chest. At exactly 2 o'clock, a black sedan pulled into County General's parking lot. The valet, hastily stationed that morning, rushed forward, but Jeff waved him off and parked himself. He sat for a moment looking at the building. Gray concrete, small windows, the kind of place designed for function over comfort. The kind of place where good people went to work and the system slowly ground them down. Not today. Jeff stepped out of the car, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the entrance. His shoes clicked against wet pavement. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the lobby fell silent. Staff members froze mid-conversation. A security guard straightened. The receptionist's smile went rigid with panic. Jeffrey Scott had arrived, and everyone in County General Hospital was about to learn what happened when you punished kindness. The conference room smelled like fear disguised as air freshener. Administrators sat rigid in leather chairs, laptops open but ignored. Margaret Torres stood near the back wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. The hospital's chief executive, Richard Palmer, sat at the head of the table, his smile practiced but strained. Jeffrey Scott stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, studying the parking lot below. He hadn't said a word since entering 5 minutes ago. The silence was deliberate, surgical. Let them sweat. Finally, he turned. "How many nurses work here?" he asked. Palmer cleared his throat. "Approximately 240, full and part-time combined." "Retention rate?" "We're within industry standards." "That's not an answer." Palmer shifted. 63% over the past 2 years. Jeff's eyebrow lifted. "So you lose a third of your nursing staff every 2 years. Healthcare is demanding. People burn out, or they're pushed out." Jeff's tone remained even, but the temperature in the room dropped. "Tell me about your termination protocols." "We follow all legal guidelines," Torres interjected from the back. "Progressive discipline, documented warnings." "I didn't ask you," Jeff said without looking at her. She fell silent. Palmer opened a folder, fumbling. Our HR processes are thorough. We document everything. Performance issues are addressed through— Call Dessy Edmond, Jeff interrupted. The room went still. I'm sorry? Palmer blinked. The nurse you fired this morning. Call her. Tell her to come back. Now. Torres stepped forward. Mr. Scott, with all due respect, personnel decisions are internal matters. Ms. Edmond was terminated for cause. For being 10 minutes late after rescuing someone in a storm. Jeff's eyes finally landed on her. That's the cause? Torres' mouth opened, closed. There were multiple complaints. Filed by you 3 and 5 days after 4 years of spotless service. Jeff turned to Palmer. Do you find that pattern unusual, Richard? Sweat beaded on Palmer's forehead. I'd need to review it later. Right now, make the call. Palmer reached for his phone with trembling hands. 30 minutes later, Dessy Edmond stood outside the conference room, confusion and dread warring in her chest. The call had been brief, cryptic. Come back to the hospital. Conference room B. It's urgent. She'd almost ignored it, almost stayed home with her spreadsheet in her fear. But something in the administrator's voice, a tremor maybe, or desperation, made her come. Now, standing before the closed door, she wondered if they'd called her back to humiliate her further, to make her sign away her right to sue, to squeeze one last bit of dignity from her bones. She knocked anyway. Come in, a voice called. Dessy stepped inside and froze. The room was full. Administrators she'd only seen in passing. Margaret Torres against the back wall, face unreadable. And at the center, standing by the window in a tailored suit, was the man from the rain. Jeff. Her breath caught. He looked different in daylight. Taller somehow, though that made no sense. His gray hair was combed back, his posture commanding. But his eyes were the same. Sharp, weary, kind. Ms. Edmond, he said gently, thank you for coming. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. I don't understand. Please sit. Jeff gestured to an empty chair. Dessy sat, every nerve screaming that this was a trap. Around the table, administrators avoided her gaze. Torres stared at the floor. Jeff remained standing. Last night, he began, addressing the room, my car broke down on Highway 52 during the storm. I was stranded, soaked, freezing. I'd been walking for over an hour. No signal, no help. Dessy's hands gripped the armrests. Then a nurse stopped, Jeff continued. She didn't ask who I was, didn't ask for anything in return. She saw someone in need and she helped. She took me to her home, gave me her only blanket, made sure I was safe. His gaze swept the room. That nurse was Dessy Edmond. Whispers rippled through the administrators. Torres's face drained of color. Jeff turned to Dessy, his voice softer now. You didn't recognize me. I'm grateful for that. It meant your kindness was genuine, not calculated, not strategic, just human decency. Dessy's throat tightened. She couldn't speak. This morning, Jeff's tone hardened as he addressed Palmer. You fired her. For being late, for stopping to save someone's life. Palmer stammered. We didn't know. You didn't care, Jeff corrected. You saw a budget line, not a person. You built a case on fabricated complaints to justify cutting a nurse who actually gives a damn about her patients. He placed a folder on the table. Dessy's personnel file. 4 years of exemplary service, commendations, awards, then 3 complaints in 5 days, all filed by the same supervisor. Jeff's eyes landed on Torres. Complaints that contradict every patient review Ms. Edmond has ever received. Torres opened her mouth, then closed it. Jeff turned back to Dessy. Ms. Edmond, I want to be clear about something. I'm not here out of charity. I'm not repaying a debt. I'm here because this hospital and every institution I invest in should be built on integrity. You embody that. They tried to erase it. Tears blurred Dessy's vision. Effective immediately, Jeff announced. Dessy Edmond is reinstated. Full back pay, full benefits. Gasps filled the room. Furthermore, Jeff continued, his voice rising with quiet authority, I am personally funding her enrollment in the Advanced Nursing Leadership Program at State Medical. Tuition, books, expenses, everything. Because character like hers deserves investment, not termination. Dessy's hands flew to her mouth. A sob broke free. And when she completes that program, Jeff added, locking eyes with Palmer, she will return here to lead the patient care initiative I'm funding. A new wing, built on compassion, dignity, and the values you people seem to have forgotten. Applause erupted, scattered at first, then building. Some administrators clapped out of relief, others out of genuine admiration. A young nurse near the door wiped her eyes. Dessy couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room spun. Jeff crossed to her, knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "You reminded me why I got into this work," he said quietly, just for her. "Let me remind them why they should stay in it." I don't know what to say," Dessy whispered. "Say you'll accept." She nodded, tears streaming freely now. Yes, thank you." Jeff stood, offered his hand. She took it, standing on trembling legs. The room stood with her, applause swelling. Palmer stammered something about making arrangements. Torres slipped out a side door, unnoticed. The other administrators crowded forward with congratulations that reeked of self-preservation. But Dessy barely heard them. She stood in the center of the storm she'd somehow survived. Dignity restored, future reborn. As the room slowly emptied, Jeff lingered by the door. "Mr. Scott?" Dessy called. He turned. "Why?" she asked. "Really why?" Jeff smiled faintly. "Because some people spend their whole lives looking for purpose. You live it without thinking. That's rare, and it's worth protecting." He left before she could respond. Outside in the parking lot, Torres stood by her car, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and venomous. Inside, Dessy stood alone in the conference room, staring at her reflection in the window. She'd been saved. But storms, she was about to learn, had a way of circling back. 3 weeks after her reinstatement, Dessy Edmond arrived at County General before sunrise. The hospital was different now, or maybe she was. She wore the same navy scrubs, walked the same corridors, but everything felt sharper, heavier. Eyes followed her. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Smiles were polite but didn't reach anyone's eyes. Success, she was learning, created a particular kind of loneliness. She clocked in and headed to the supply room to prep for her shift. The new patient care initiative wouldn't launch for months, but Jeff had insisted she remain on the floor, stay connected to the work while completing her leadership coursework online. "Never lose touch with why you started," he'd said. She unlocked the supply cabinet and froze. The morphine count was off. Dessy ran her finger down the log, checking entries against physical inventory. 2 vials short. She recounted, checked the locked drawer, recounted again. Still short. Her stomach tightened. Narcotic discrepancies weren't just serious, they were career-ending. She logged the issue immediately, flagged her supervisor, and moved on with her shift. Probably just a documentation error. Someone forgot to sign out properly. But 2 days later, it happened again. This time it was IV antibiotics. The overnight count didn't match the morning inventory. When Dessy checked the digital log, her access code appeared beside a withdrawal she'd never made. Her hands went cold. She printed the log, circled the entry, and brought it to the charge nurse, a woman named Beverly who'd worked at County General for 15 years. "Look at this," Dessy said quietly. "I wasn't even on shift when this withdrawal was logged." Beverly studied it, her expression unreadable. "You sure?" "I was in class. I have attendance records." Beverly folded the paper. "I'll look into it." But her tone said, "I don't believe you." That afternoon, whispers started. Dessy caught fragments, inventory issues, her access code. Too convenient. She kept her head down, focused on her patients, but the weight of suspicion pressed against her ribs like a slowly tightening fist. By the end of the week, a formal review was opened. Dessy sat across from an HR representative, a thin man with rimless glasses who spoke in the monotone of someone reading from a script. "Standard procedure," he assured him. "Any narcotic discrepancy triggers an audit. Nothing personal." "My code is being used when I'm not here," Dessy said evenly. "That's not a discrepancy. That's fraud. We'll investigate all possibilities." "Will you check who else has access? Who else was on shift those nights?" The man made a note. "We'll be thorough." But Dessy heard what he didn't say. You're the easiest target. She left the meeting feeling like the walls were closing in. At home that night, she sat in the dark, staring at her phone. Part of her wanted to call her sister, to hear a voice that didn't carry judgment. But what would she say? They're trying to destroy me again? Everything Jeff gave me is about to be ripped away? Instead, she opened her laptop and reviewed the logs she'd screenshotted. Dates, times, access codes. She studied them until her eyes burned, searching for patterns, for proof, for anything that would show she wasn't losing her mind. Then she saw it. 3 of the discrepancies occurred within an hour of shift changes, overlapping windows when her code could have been accessed by someone logging out under her credentials. She grabbed her phone. Jeff answered on the second ring. "Dessy, everything all right?" His voice, calm, steady, made her throat tighten. She almost didn't want to burden him with this. She almost convinced herself she could handle it alone. "No," she said quietly. "Someone's setting me up." Silence, then. "Tell me everything." She did. The missing inventory, the falsified logs, the access codes used when she wasn't even in the building. The whispers, the suspicion, the way people looked at her like she'd betrayed a trust she'd worked 4 years to earn. When she finished, Jeff was quiet for a long moment. "This is deliberate," he finally said. "I know." "Do you have enemies there?" Dessy laughed bitterly. "I thought I had colleagues. Turns out success makes you friendless." "Not success," Jeff corrected. "Elevation. Some people can't stand watching others rise." "So what do I do?" "You keep your head down and do your job perfectly," Jeff said. "Let them think they're winning. Meanwhile, I'll handle the rest." "Jeff, I don't want you to—" "Dessy," his tone was gentle but firm, "you saved my life in that storm. Let me protect yours now." She closed her eyes, exhaustion seeping into her bones. "Okay, I'll call you tomorrow." After he hung up, Dessy sat in the darkness, the weight of uncertainty pressing down. She'd been here before, accused, cornered, helpless. But this time felt different. This time, she had something to lose. The next morning, Jeff made 3 phone calls. The first was to a private security firm that specialized in corporate investigations. The second was to his attorney, requesting a full audit of County General's internal systems. The third was to Richard Palmer, delivered in a tone that left no room for negotiation. "There are irregularities in your narcotic inventory," Jeff said. "I'm conducting an independent review. You will provide full access to security footage, digital logs, and staff schedules. Non-negotiable." Palmer stammered about protocol and privacy. "Your choice," Jeff interrupted. "Cooperate now or explain to your board why a major investor pulled funding and filed a formal complaint with the state medical board." Palmer cooperated. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation moved like a shadow through County General. Cameras were reviewed, digital timestamps cross-referenced, access patterns analyzed. Dessy went to work each day feeling like she was walking on glass. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown louder. Someone had leaked that an external audit was underway, and now the entire staff watched her like she was a bomb waiting to detonate. Beverly stopped making eye contact. The young nurses she'd mentored kept their distance. Even patients seemed wary, as if suspicion was contagious. One afternoon, as Dessy restocked a supply cart, she overheard 2 nurses talking in the break room. "I heard they found her code on 6 different discrepancies." 6? Jesus. And Scott's still protecting her? Money talks. She probably has something on him. Dessy's hands froze on the gauze boxes. She wanted to march in there, to defend herself, to scream that she'd done nothing wrong. But she'd learned that accusations stuck harder than truth. So she finished stocking the cart and walked away. That night, Jeffrey called. "We have something," he said. Dessy sat up. "What?" "Security footage. From the night of the 3rd discrepancy. Someone accessed the supply room using an override code, one that bypasses individual credentials." "Who?" Jeff paused. "You need to prepare yourself, Dessy. When this comes out, it's going to hurt." Her chest tightened. "Who was it?" "We'll know for certain tomorrow," Jeff said. "But the footage is clear, and the person behind this has been closer than you think." Dessy's hands trembled. "Jeff, tell me." "Tomorrow," he said gently, "when we have all the evidence, when we can prove it beyond any doubt." After he hung up, Dessy sat in the darkness, her mind racing through faces, names, possibilities. Someone close, someone she'd trusted, and tomorrow the truth would surface, whether she was ready for it or not. The conference room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Dessy sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. Around the table sat Richard Palmer, the HR director, 2 hospital board members, and half a dozen senior staff. Security personnel stood by the door. Jeff sat at the head of the table, a laptop open before him, his expression unreadable. Beverly, the charge nurse, sat 3 seats down from Dessy, eyes fixed on the table. "Thank you all for coming," Jeff began, his voice cutting through the tension. "Over the past 2 weeks, we've conducted a comprehensive audit of narcotic inventory discrepancies at this facility. What we found goes beyond simple documentation errors." He clicked a button. The projector displayed a spreadsheet, columns of dates, demos, access codes, and withdrawal records. 6 separate incidents over 3 weeks, Jeff continued, all flagged under Dessy Edmond's credentials. All occurring when Ms. Edmond was either off-site or verifiably in other locations. Palmer shifted uncomfortably. "So it was identity theft? Someone stole her access?" "Not exactly." Jeff clicked again. The screen changed to security footage, black and white, time-stamped. The supply room, empty at first, then a figure entered, moved to the narcotic cabinet, and used a keypad override. The room leaned forward collectively. Jeff zoomed in. The figure's face became clear. Beverly. Gasps rippled through the room. Dessy's breath caught. She'd suspected co-workers, rivals, even administrators. But Beverly, the woman who'd mentored her during orientation 4 years ago, who'd covered her shifts when she'd been sick, who'd taught her the unwritten rules of survival in an understaffed hospital. Beverly remained motionless, staring at the table. "Charge Nurse Beverly Warren," Jeff said evenly, used a supervisory override code to access the supply cabinet. She then manually altered digital logs to reflect Ms. Edmond's credentials instead of her own. Another click. Screen captures of log entries, side-by-side comparisons showing metadata alterations. "The timestamps don't lie," Jeff continued. "The system records every modification, every deleted line, every substituted access code. Nurse Warren systematically framed Miss Edmond over a 3-week period." Palmer's face had gone pale. "Beverly, is this true?" Beverly finally looked up, her jaw tight, eyes cold. "She didn't belong here." The words landed like stones. "Excuse me?" Palmer stammered. Beverly's voice shook with barely contained fury. "I worked here 15 years. 15. Double shifts, holidays, weekends. Watching people leave, positions cut, benefits slashed. Then she shows up, late, gets fired like the rest of us would, and suddenly she's the hospital's golden child?" She turned to Dessy, venom in her eyes. "You stopped for some rich man in the rain and suddenly you're untouchable? Getting sponsorships? Leadership programs? While the rest of us are still drowning in the same broken system?" Dessy's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the pain in Beverly's voice cut deeper than the accusations. "So I made sure everyone saw what I saw," Beverly continued, her voice cracking. "That you weren't special. That you'd crack under pressure, just like anyone else." Silence swallowed the room. Jeff stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Nurse Warren, I understand your frustration. Healthcare workers are undervalued, overworked, and often overlooked. But tearing down someone who showed compassion isn't justice. It's cruelty disguised as fairness." Beverly laughed bitterly. "You wouldn't understand. You walk in with your money and your power, and you think you can fix everything. But you're gone in 6 months. We're still here, living with whatever damage your charity leaves behind." "Then let's talk about damage," Jeff said quietly. He turned to Palmer. "How many nurses has this hospital lost in the past 2 years?" Palmer hesitated. 67. "And how many exit interviews cited hostile work environment?" Silence. Jeff continued. "Beverly Warren isn't the disease here. She's a symptom. You've created a culture where good people turn on each other because there's not enough support, not enough recognition, not enough humanity." He gestured to Dessy. Ms. Edmond wasn't elevated because she knew someone powerful. She was elevated because she embodies what this institution claims to value, but has forgotten how to protect. He turned to Beverly. You had a choice. You could have fought for better conditions for everyone. Instead, you tried to destroy the one person who reminded you what integrity looks like. Beverly's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Jeff nodded to the security personnel. Nurse Warren, you're terminated effective immediately. Legal counsel will contact you regarding potential criminal charges for falsifying medical records. Two officers stepped forward. Beverly stood, movements mechanical. As they escorted her past Dessy's chair, she stopped. I'm sorry, Beverly whispered, so quietly only Dessy could hear. I was wrong. Dessy looked up, tears blurring her vision. I forgive you. Beverly's composure cracked. She nodded once, then let the officers lead her out. The room remained frozen, processing what had just unfolded. Palmer cleared his throat. Ms. Edmond, on behalf of the hospital, I apologize for what you've endured. We will review our protocols to ensure— Mr. Palmer, Dessy interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I don't want revenge. I don't want someone's career destroyed to make me feel vindicated. I want things to change. She stood, addressing the room. Beverly was right about one thing. This system is broken. Nurses are burning out, cutting corners, turning on each other because there aren't enough resources, enough support, enough recognition. If my story means anything, let it be a catalyst for fixing that. Jeff watched her, quiet pride in his eyes. Dessy continued. When the new wing opens, I want it to be more than nice equipment and fresh paint. I want it built on respect, fair staffing ratios, mental health support, mentorship programs, a place where people like Beverly don't feel so invisible that cruelty becomes their only voice. The board members exchanged glances. Palmer nodded slowly. We'll make it happen. In writing, Jeff added, with accountability measures, or the funding gets reallocated. Palmer swallowed. Understood. As the meeting dissolved, staff filtered out in subdued clusters. A few approached Dessy with quiet apologies. Others simply nodded, respect replacing the suspicion that had hung over her for weeks. Jeff waited until the room cleared, then approached her. You could have let me destroy her, he said softly. Dessy shook her head. Hurt people hurt people. She was drowning, and she pulled me under because she did not know how else to stay afloat. I understand that. Not everyone would. Maybe, Dessy said, wiping her eyes, but I keep thinking about that night in the rain. You were stranded, desperate. I could have kept driving. Most people did, but I stopped because I saw a person who needed help. Not an opportunity, not a transaction. Just a person. She looked at Jeff. Beverly needed help too. She just didn't know how to ask for it. Jeff studied her for a long moment. You're going to change this place, Dessy, not because of money or authority, because you refuse to let pain turn you cruel. Dessy smiled faintly. Someone once told me that storms don't break you. They show you who you were meant to become. Smart person, Jeff said. Very. Outside, rain began to fall again. Soft, steady, cleansing. The second storm had passed, and in its wake, County General Hospital would begin, slowly, to heal. 6 months later, the rain returned. But this time it fell gently against the windows of the new hospital wing, soft and rhythmic, more lullaby than storm. Inside, light spilled through corridors designed not just for efficiency, but for healing. Wide hallways, natural lighting, private consultation rooms, where families could cry or celebrate without an audience. Dessy Edmond stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, watching nurses move through their rounds with a calm that came from proper staffing ratios and adequate rest breaks. No one was running, no one was shouting. Patients smiled instead of grimacing when call buttons were answered within minutes, not hours. This was what healthcare could look like when compassion drove the blueprint. Mrs. Edmond, a young nurse, approached, barely out of orientation. The family in 3 of 4 wants to thank you personally. The grandfather, he said you reminded him why he still believes in hospitals. Dessy's chest warmed. Tell them I'll stop by after rounds. The nurse hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. How do you do it? Stay kind when everything's so hard? Dessy smiled, remembering a night 6 months ago when exhaustion had nearly convinced her to keep driving. Kindness isn't about everything being easy, she said. It's about choosing to see people even when you're too tired to see yourself clearly. The young nurse nodded, something shifting in her expression, and walked away with a little more confidence in her step. Dessy continued her rounds, adjusting a pillow here, listening to a patient's story there. The new wing had been open for 2 weeks, and already it felt different from the rest of the hospital. Not because of the architecture, but because of the culture being built within it. At the nurses' station, a whiteboard displayed the week's metrics: patient satisfaction scores, response times, staff wellness check-ins, numbers that reflected humans, not just hospital efficiency. Looking good, a voice said behind her. Dessy turned. Jeff stood in his signature tailored coat, hands in his pockets, a quiet pride in his eyes. You're early, she said. The dedication ceremony isn't until 3. I wanted to see it without the cameras and speeches. He gestured to the corridor. Walk with me? They moved through the wing together, past rooms where patients rested comfortably, past family lounges designed for marathon vigils, past staff break rooms that actually encouraged people to rest instead of collapse. You built something remarkable here, Jeff said. Dessy shook her head. You funded it. I wrote checks. You gave it a soul. They stopped at a window overlooking the parking lot. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the world beyond into impressionist shapes. Jeff reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. I have something for you, he said. Dessy took it carefully, recognizing the weight of official documents inside. She opened it, scanned the first page, and her breath caught. Director of Patient Care Innovation, she read aloud. Permanent appointment, full autonomy over program development, staffing decisions, and her voice faltered. A seat on the hospital board? Effective immediately, Jeff confirmed. You've earned it, not because you helped me that night, but because you've proven what leadership grounded in compassion can accomplish. Dessy's eyes welled. Jeff, I don't know if I'm ready. You stopped in a storm to save a stranger, he interrupted gently. You faced false accusations with dignity. You forgave someone who tried to destroy you. You're more than ready. She looked down at the papers, then back at him. Why? Why invest so much in one person? Jeff turned to the window, watching rain trace patterns on the glass. 40 years ago, I got into healthcare because I believed it could be a force for good. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Profit margins became more important than people. Efficiency overshadowed empathy. He looked at her. You reminded me what I'd lost. And watching you transform this place reminded me what's possible when we refuse to let the system crush our humanity. He reached for another envelope. There's something else. Dessy opened it. Inside, legal documents establishing a scholarship fund. The Dessy Edmond Compassionate Care Scholarship, Jeff explained. Full tuition for nurses from underserved backgrounds pursuing advanced certifications. 20 students a year. Renewable. It launches next semester. Dessy covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. I can't. This is too much. It's not enough, Jeff said. But it's a start. Your story that night in the rain, it matters, Dessy. Not because of the happy ending, but because you chose to stop when everyone else kept driving. That choice rippled outward. It saved me. It transformed this hospital. And now it'll help others who have your same heart, but not your same opportunities. Dessy wiped her eyes, trying to find words adequate to the moment. That night, I just saw someone who needed help. I know, Jeff said softly. That's why it mattered. They stood together in silence, watching the rain. It was peaceful now, the kind that washed things clean instead of tearing them apart. Do you regret it? Jeff asked. Stopping that night, knowing everything that followed? Dessy thought about the accusations, the fear, the weeks of wondering if kindness had been the worst decision of her life. Then she looked around at the wing she'd built, the nurses she'd mentored, the patients sleeping peacefully in rooms designed around dignity. Not for a second, she said. That afternoon, the dedication ceremony filled the new wing's main lobby. Photographers captured smiling officials cutting ribbons. Local news crews interviewed grateful families. Board members gave speeches about innovation and community investment. But Dessy barely heard any of it. She stood near the back, watching patients and families move through spaces designed to heal bodies and honor spirits. A little girl in a wheelchair laughed as a therapy dog nuzzled her hand. An elderly man held his wife's hand in a private room with a door, not a curtain. A nurse sat beside a frightened teenager, not rushing, just listening. These were the moments that mattered. The quiet victories, the small dignities restored. As the ceremony concluded and crowds dispersed, Dessy stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. Puddles reflected the evening sky, streaks of orange and purple painted across water. Jeff joined her on the steps, silent for a moment. "You know what I remember most about that night?" he said finally. "Not being stranded, not the storm, but the way you didn't hesitate once you decided to help. Like kindness was instinct, not calculation." Dessy smiled. "Maybe that's what we forget, that helping each other shouldn't require a reason beyond someone needing it. The world would be better if more people remembered that." "Then maybe that's the real work," Dessy said. "Not building wings or funding scholarships, but teaching people they don't have to choose between surviving and staying human." Jeff nodded slowly. "You're going to do extraordinary things, Dessy Edmond." She corrected. "We're going to do extraordinary things." They stood together as dusk settled over the hospital, the new wing glowing behind them like a promise kept. Somewhere in the city, a nurse would finish a brutal shift and drive home exhausted. Somewhere, a stranger would stand stranded, desperate for help, and somewhere someone would have to choose: keep driving or stop. Dessy adjusted her badge, breathed deep, and stepped forward into the life she'd built from a single choice in the rain. Some storms don't break you. They introduce you to who you were always meant to become.